For all things Charlotte Readers Podcast, check out charlottereaderspodcast.com. You can find a list of all episodes, an alphabetical guest list with links, detailed show notes for each episode, a community blog, and more. We'd love to have you visit.
All right, we're in Act 2 now, and I suppose I should say to you, the listener, thank you for still being with us. And, you know, what we're trying to do here is provide more content in each episode, but only twice a month, so that, you know, if you don't have time to consume all this at one time, obviously don't. Right? Is that a good way to say that?
You have permission.
Yeah. Or come back, you know, and you know, it'll pick up right where it left off. Or if you're traveling, you know, if you're whatever you like to listen as you walk, maybe you get more of it in, or maybe, you know, the show notes that Sarah's creating, we're going to have timestamps there, and also in the newsletter that Hannah's taking lead on, we'll have timestamps there, so you can see kind of where you want to go. If you want to go right to the writing discussion, or right to the marketing discussion, or right to a particular author, and listen. Of course, we'd love you to listen to the whole episode and give us feedback on the whole thing, but maybe you'll just give us feedback on some pieces of it. But yeah, so we're going to do that, and that was a real dog barking, wasn't it?
You know, I was looking at them out of the side of my. I'm like, they're playing now, so they're probably gonna insert themselves into this conversation.
I don't even need to go to my mixer now. We're good, then, right? So
yeah, you're no need for that with these two.
Well, now we're gonna. There you go. I think they heard us. So we're gonna be doing this thing now in the writing question. The writing question is, how hard is it to turn a novel into a screenplay, and other screenplay writing tips? And Sarah is fresh off of having sold her first major screenplay, right, Sarah? So first, before we get into the technical part of this, I'm curious about this. I know Hannah is too, but talk a little bit about whatever you can tell us, about what you're working on and what was accepted and that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. So it's a romantic comedy. It's kind of an ensemble story like Love Actually, where there's multiple storylines, but they all sort of intersect and the characters exist in the same universe. And I've always just loved that sort of structure. I think there's a lot of storytelling potential there. So this is something that I wrote initially a couple of years ago, just on my own, just as a spec script, because it was just an idea that I had that I kind of latched onto. And I used to work in LA. I was an assistant at different production and management companies. So I reached out to a producer who I knew there and sent her and her company the script, and they were interested in it. And we did a round of revisions together, and then they sent it off to a studio, and the studio wanted to buy it. So now I'm into the process of doing revisions with the studio as well.
So...
Woohoo! That is all us.
We got people in the background. They're just
That's
clapping.
awesome. That is so cool, Sarah. That's really, really cool.
Oh, thank you.
Great. And the dogs are happy too. So.
I know they're cheering right now. That's what they're doing.
Our two extra co-hosts.
Yeah, you've got some fans over here in Charleston. That's so cool, though. How long was that process for you?
On this particular one, I initially wrote, I think, the first draft probably about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. Obviously, I've been working on other projects in between then. I like to kind of take a while to work on things, because I'll write a draft of something and then I send it off to people and ask for notes, and I work on other stuff while I'm waiting for their notes, and then I come back to it. And so I have like a fresher perspective when I have some time away. So I was kind of working on it off and on for 1 year or 2. And then I sent it to these producers, I think like in January, earlier this year. And we did like our round of revisions on it. And then once the studio got involved, things kind of pick up the pace, because they have obviously a schedule they're working on where it's like, well, if you want to shoot this, we're going to do it in this month. And so we have to kind of adhere to that timeline. So it's definitely something where it's like you go at your own pace, and then all of a sudden everything happens at once.
So how did that feel, Sarah? I know you've been a published novelist, traditionally published. You do a lot of other writing too, but to have your first screenplay, how'd that feel?
It's awesome. I mean, I'm sure that you can relate to this as a writer, but writing is just so subjective that you never know if anything you're doing is good, quote unquote, or if you're doing anything right. And you can write something and maybe you love it, but there's always going to be other people who don't like it. So to have a company actually like put their money behind it is probably the closest thing you'll get to an actual like real stamp of approval on a project. And not that you should, as a writer, I think you should try to seek a lot of your value and your motivation inward in terms of finding joy in the craft itself and writing something that you enjoy. But it is nice to have that sort of external validation, honestly, and proof that you're doing something that somebody actually thinks is worthwhile.
Yeah, that's great. Well, keep us updated on that, and when it comes out, we'll have a watch party or something.
Yeah, that'll be awesome.
And now that we've established your credentials here, let's jump into the topic. I mean, the question begs a quick answer. How hard is it to turn a novel into a screenplay?
7 out of 10 hard. I mean, I would say it's harder to write a novel, I think, than to write a screenplay. It takes more work. With screenwriting, there are more sort of restrictions you have to pay attention to, and some different kind of things you have to take into consideration that you don't necessarily have to consider when you're writing fiction. But writing a novel, you're the only game in town in a way. Like the author is pretty much the only person responsible for creating this piece, even though there might be editors involved along the way and stuff like that. But with a screenplay, it's like there might be multiple writers who write the script, and then the script itself is just a blueprint. So there's going to be probably hundreds of other people involved in the project from start to finish to actually get a movie or a TV show made. So you're doing less of the process. So like, for instance, in a book where, if you want your readers to know what a character is wearing, you have to describe that. But in a screenplay, you're only going to describe what someone's wearing is if it's essential to the story in some way. Otherwise, like there's costume designers, and then that's their role in their department, and so you kind of leave that up to them to do their job. So you do less of the work. So if, for instance, you've already written a novel and now you're trying to adapt it into a screenplay, a lot of what you're doing is going to be kind of stripping down and taking things out and figuring out what doesn't belong in there, which can still be challenging. That still takes a lot of work, especially if it's something that you've written and it's close to you and you feel like all of it is important. So you have to kind of figure out what doesn't belong. But I would say writing a screenplay is very much about the story and the structure. So if you can kind of find the spine of your story and what really matters in terms of what moves the action forward, that's a great place to start. And then you can sort of strip out everything else from there.
So is it, obviously in a novel, you've got a lot of things. You've got what you just described as what people are wearing, but you've got the surroundings and the settings. You've got some character development. You got some backstory. Am I correct that I heard somewhere that for like a screenplay, it's pretty much only about 100 pages, and those 100 pages are like double spaced, and you're not really getting into a whole lot of, it's really dialogue, right? For the most part, is
exactly.
what you're writing.
Yeah, so the general rule of thumb is that in a script, a page of a script is equivalent to about a minute on screen. So it used to be that scripts for a movie would be probably about 120 pages, but movies have actually gotten shorter. So now there's more and more pressure to keep things shorter, closer to like 90 to 100 pages for a feature script. Obviously for TV, it's going to be a different length depending on how long the episode is. And then there's a lot more white space on the page than there would be in a novel or a memoir or something like that. So there's a lot less, but that also means that every single word counts. And you have to pack a real punch with every line. So anytime that I write a screenplay, I'm going through and I'm making a lot of cuts and trying to get it as short as possible because every page really matters. But yeah, it's just the action lines or description lines and then the dialogue. And the action description is really just the nuts and bolts of what needs to be there. You're not giving any sort of extra description or you don't get to use like the lovely prose that you might use in writing a novel. It's much more sort of efficient and just to the point, get the information across.
When you're like writing, so when you were writing your book, did you already kind of envision it being a movie or a show? Like, do you kind of do that as you're writing, or is it something that kind of comes after?
I think for me, I tend to, since I do write both fiction and screenwriting, I like to sort of go where the story leads me. Like if it's a story that I think would work well as a novel, I'll think of it that way. If it's a story that I think would work better as either like a feature or a TV show, I'll think of it that way. When I wrote my first novel, The Plus One, I had never written a novel before. I'd only done screenwriting. So initially I did think of it as a screenplay, and I think it could potentially work in that form. But I also saw potential for it as a novel, and I was at a place in my life where I finally had like time to try writing a novel, and I wanted to to try that creative challenge. So I did it that way. But it's also since been optioned for actually television as opposed to a movie. And
awesome.
That was interesting to me because I think obviously there's a big creative change there, when you're going from like a closed-ended story like a book or a movie to something that would become a series. But I think that would be really exciting to kind of open it up and change the characters around and see how it could become more of like a continuous story.
A lot more room too for growth, I guess. I think
exactly.
like with TV and movies too, I love TV so much. Like, I don't know. I think the reason I like it so much though is because you can build the relationship with the characters a little bit better. It's like, because you have more time and space to do that. That's really interesting. And so did you study screenwriting in school, or you've been doing that first then before you dove into writing novels?
So when I was in college, I studied, my major was English, and then I did 2 different minors. One was in creative writing, but that was focused more on poetry, which has definitely been a huge boon for my career. A lot of money in the poetry world. And then my other minor was screenwriting. So I did get to study screenwriting in school.
It's a good mix.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're very different, but I love both of those. And so I feel like I learned some good kind of like basics of the craft of screenwriting in school, but it's definitely something where to learn the industry, you kind of have to be in it and be immersed in it and like hear how people develop things and what studios and producers and all that are looking for. So I went out to LA after school and was working in that industry and reading scripts all the time and that sort of thing. And it's just like we were talking about with the writing tip from Charlotte Lit. Like if you want to write books, you should be reading books. If you want to write screenplays, you should be watching film and TV and reading screenplays. So
I'm curious about some of the tips that you have for people that are thinking about, taking this on. Say you're, a short story writer. Say you've written a novel, but you want to try to tackle this thing, called screenwriting. Where do you start, and what are some of your thoughts on some of the basic things you need to think about?
Well, I would say, like, say you have a novel that you've written and you're trying to decide if you think it would be good for a movie or a TV show. Look at the story because, like I said, it is a very kind of story-driven medium. And there are things that might work as a novel that can be a little bit like looser structurally and more focused on maybe the prose or kind of the voice and the perspective of the main character, but that doesn't always translate as well on screen. So I would think about, like, does your story have a really clear storyline with like a clear inciting incident and a climax and all that sort of thing? Also, like, how sort of internal versus external in it? Is it a story that's more about kind of the thoughts of the characters, or is there more external conflict? The more external it is, the easier it's going to be to kind of show visually as opposed to writing it in prose. And I would also think about kind of the marketplace, like, what are you seeing that's being released as films and TV shows right now? Do you think that your story is one that might have an audience? Because it takes a lot more financial investment to make a movie or a TV show than to publish a book. And so I think there is more room in publishing to publish stories that might hit like a very small niche audience because it requires less sort of, output to make a book. Whereas with a movie or a TV show, there's a big financial risk behind it. So it has to be something that's going to hit a kind of wider audience as well.
Some of what you talk about there is just sort of inherent in any story or novel. That is, you need to have an inciting incident, you need to have a good storyline, you need to have characters that are interesting and internal and external conflict. But I see the point about the external conflict because that's what's going to visually, show up on the screen. I know nothing, Sarah, about the process of having someone consider a screenplay. I know a lot about the world of, submitting novels to publishers and that kind of thing. How does it work in the screenwriting world?
Well, it's, they say that it's all about who you know, and that's really true. It is a very kind of insular, incestuous kind of industry, you could say. And so it's something where it is very hard to break in from outside. Even if you're working in the industry, it's really hard to sell a script. But especially if you're coming in from outside, it is difficult to sort of break through those walls. So if you have any connections, use them. That's going to be your best source of trying to get your script to people who can actually do something with it. There are also contests you can enter for screenwriters. There are a lot of them out there, so just do your kind of due diligence and research because they're all going to be happy to take your money for your submission fee, and some of them are kind of more legitimate than others. But like Blue Cat is a good one, the Final Draft contest, the Launchpad contest, the Nickel. Like you can find some of the big ones online, and those are potential ways to actually get your script to legitimate people and companies. You can cold query agents and managers the same way that you would with a book, but it's more difficult. I think people in the book world are much more receptive to that, whereas most agents in film and TV are probably not going to look at unsolicited queries. Some managers will, some managers won't. So again, just kind of do your research, but that's a potential way in. I will just say though, like on a good note, if you already have a novel that you've written, that's a great step forward because people love IP in Hollywood. They love having something that's based on something else. So if you can say like, this is based on a novel that was published, that's going to give you a big leg up as opposed to just a script that you wrote. Even if it's you wrote the novel and you also wrote the script and it's the same idea, they like the fact that there's already a novel out there.
Now, you're a traditionally published author with your first rom-com. Do they also own the script rights for things like this, or can you turn that yourself into a screenplay? Is that how does that work exactly?
Yeah, so with my first novel, The Plus One, the rights, I don't think the publisher actually owned the film rights. There's a production company that optioned it for television, so they currently have the rights. And then, if the option expires, the rights go back, I think, to me, and then another company could potentially option it as well in the future. So they didn't own that. Now every deal is different, so I'm not sure exactly. Different publishers might do it differently, but in my case, I was able to option it out to a company.
Any thoughts on writing your Plus One into a screenplay?
It's something I've thought about. I think I would have to be kind of in the right creative space for it. Like I tend to, when I write a project, I'm in it when I'm working on it, and then once I'm done with it, I'm done with it. I have other ideas that I want to like move on and write. So I think I would need to feel inspired enough by it to want to go back into that world. But I do think like with the idea of doing it for television, that did kind of pique my interest because that's a way to totally revamp it and kind of reimagine the characters, as opposed to as a film, it might be a more sort of straightforward adaptation. But yeah, I don't know. I might at some point like try writing a pilot version of it. We'll see.
So Hannah, we may be hanging out with somebody really famous here.
I know.
She's going to get on TV and she's going to get in the movie.
I'll lay out my red carpet here in the office.
Yeah. We need to put more of the applause coming up.
Exactly. But I assume in that world, just like in the publishing world, there's rejection along the way and you just have to stick with it, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think all writers face that, right? I think that's pretty universal.
I think that's a sign to know that you've kind of like made it where you need to be if you've gotten like
or at least you're
X
trying.
Number.
Like you know, if you're putting stuff out there, you're probably gonna get rejected sometimes, but it's better than not trying.
Yeah, I feel like all the best writers are always saying that too. They're like, "Oh, I was rejected like 1,000,001 times when we first started doing this."
So, Sarah, any parting thoughts on screenwriting before we go to our next piece there?
If you're interested, try it. I mean, I always am an advocate of if you do one type of writing, like stretch your muscles and try another kind. So it's always worth dabbling and picking up some new skills. We have a newsletter called Beyond 300, and we'd love to have you sign up. This is where we share what's coming on the podcast, provide helpful links, and keep you updated on the podcast and the hosts. You can sign up at charlottereaderspodcast.com or the websites of the hosts, landiswade.com, saraharcherwrites.com, or spellboundpublicrelations.com. And by the way, we won't spam you because that takes way too much time.